And so this is only something that kind of going into my 20s, reflecting on my childhood, I realized how much of a role money played in my mum's ability to be able to show up and support us emotionally. And so this is, I think, one of the reasons why I became so passionate about talking about Bitcoin, talking about money, talking about the impact of money on our parental bonds and how it shapes who we are and how we show up. And so I was kind of raised with a single mum. And so I think that as our money is degrading, we spend more time trying to survive and put food on the table and a roof over our heads, and less time directing energy towards what motivates us and what really kind of like fills our cup. And so I think that when you have Bitcoin, which is the inverse of the monetary system we have today, where we have a finite supply, which means as society improves in productivity and efficiency, prices fall over time. So life starts to get easier. It becomes easier to put a roof over our heads. It becomes easier to put food on the table. It means that we have more capacity. And I think that capacity is huge. Like if as an individual you have more capacity, then you can start to ask yourself questions around like, who am I and how do I want to show up? Like, what is it that really kind of like gets me up in the morning? And if that is like kids, and you want to really dedicate that time and energy to building a family and spending time with your kids, you have more capacity to do that. And that's what I absolutely love about the Bitcoin community.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Bitcoin for Family show, where every guest is your new BFF. That's your Bitcoin friend forever. I'm Scott from Shamri, and it's an honor to have you here again. Thanks to everyone who's been listening or watching. I hope you're finding the show fun and educational. And if you have been enjoying the show, I'd love it if you liked, subscribed, and shared. If you're really feeling generous, go ahead and drop a comment or a review as well. Every bit helps in spreading the word to other Bitcoin families. Now, on to this week's show. I am super excited to welcome a good friend, an author, the co-founder of Looking Glass Education, and a deep thinker to the show. Thanks for taking the time to join, Seb Bunney.
Oh man, Scott, it's such a pleasure to jump on. And maybe I'll start by just saying, like, it's been amazing being in the Bitcoin community for the last 5 years. And I think you and I would have met maybe in 2021, we started kind of chatting, and it's just been phenomenal just to see Shamri's growth over time with what you and Mallory are building, and just seeing the evolution of kind of the products you've kind of put out there. And yeah, I think there's something amazing about building this community and seeing everyone grow alongside you.
Yep, no, the feeling is mutual. And so for those, if Looking Glass is ringing a bell, so episode 14, we had Daz on. So Daz and Seb were one of the co-founders of Looking Glass. So being able to get both of them on the show, meeting them both at the same time around 2020, 2021, whatever that was. Like we said, when I was talking to Daz, it's one of those friendships where you never actually met in person, but being able to, have that virtual and then one day make that happen. Fortunately, Seb and I are much closer than Daz is, so one day maybe we can make that joint trip down to Australia. Although he did say you were welcome to go on the tail end of the tour with them. So if you want to get on that plane, you can jump on the last half of their trek through Australia in their buggy.
Oh man, I need to make it down there and see Daz. Although that said, in Madeira, which would have been really, really cool if you guys were able to make it out, but in Madeira for Bitcoin Atlantis, when was this? March of last year? Daz and I met for the first time. So although we'd known each other for almost 5 years, we'd never met in person. We had a business together, we'd written a book together, and that was the first time meeting. So one of these days we're going to catch up. And I know you and I is around the San Diego area, I think it is. Yeah. So I know you're only an hour and a half, 2-hour flight.
We will make it happen for sure. And yes, we were sad to miss Bitcoin Atlantis. Honored that Andre had us help out with the kids area from afar for a bit, but having a baby at that exact same time pretty much kind of threw that into the wind. But 2028, hopefully we can make that happen. Well, perfect. Well, this for the audience will be a slightly different show. So Seb is actually the first guest. Doesn't have a child yet, but that doesn't mean he isn't familiar with family life. He has many different Bitcoin articles, Bitcoin books that are out there. But also, if you're familiar with his blog posts and just thinking in general, is often kind of talking about the intersection of family life, parenting, education. And so this should be a fun and kind of deep diving chat in a lot of different areas. So let's get on with that. And like always, we'll kick things off with some icebreakers just to get to know Seb a little bit better. So one thing that I know about Seb is he's into paragliding. And so what is your favorite all-time place that you've glided, and what is the top place on your bucket list?
Never been asked this question before.
I get that a lot in the icebreakers. It's
so
something
good.
I'm proud of.
So, maybe I'll start by saying I never anticipated to ever paraglide. I have a massive fear of heights, huge fear of heights. And I went through a really tough breakup in 16. And at that time, I kind of said to myself, I'm going to say yes to everything that comes by. And my mum was like, you know what, Seb, you should get into paragliding. And I was like, no, I said to myself I'd say yes. And I was like, I do not want to get into paragliding. So I was just like, you know what, I'm going to honor it. So I went and took my paragliding pilot's license and started flying. And I absolutely loved it. Like there's something about like being up in a little seat up in the sky, floating around without an engine, no noise, just the kind of the silence of the wind. That's really meditative. And what paragliding has allowed me to do is just be able to travel to all of these amazing places, which normally I would go see by walking along the floor, going and seeing the monasteries, going and seeing the forests. And now all of a sudden I can kind of hike up a mountain, fly off the mountain and see everything from that aerial bird's eye view. But I'd say if there's one place that kind of stands out, I was flying in a place in Spain called Algondanales. This would have been maybe about 6 years ago. And you take off from this mountainside, and across the valley is this big rock bluff, and it had a little monastery on top of it. And what's really cool is the big vultures with like huge 2-meter wingspans will catch the thermals, the rising warm air that's coming off of the rock bluff in the monastery, and they'll kind of cruise around and fly up above the monastery. So you like cut across the valley, then you hit the thermals and you're flying up there with the vultures, and the vultures will be 5 meters away from you in the air, and you can see the feathers fluttering in the air right next to you. And so there's something really profound about like flying with the birds, and the birds see you catching thermals, you see them, and you're kind of like working as a team to hunt out how to kind of climb and gain elevation. But there's something special about being in the air and flying.
That's really cool. Any worry about the birds running into the strings or anything like that?
They're honestly, they're pretty good. There's one YouTube video you can type in of someone flying, and I think a vulture must have not been paying attention, and it flies straight into the lines, and they get tangled, and he like falls to the ground. He throws out his reserve chute, and like he survives, but the bird was like tangled in the lines. But that's the only one I've ever seen. Most of the time, they're pretty cognizant of like other pilots in the area. There is one really cool video if people are searching for it and want to show their kids. There's a video of, I think he's a Chilean pilot, and he's flying along, and this vulture comes along and lands on his feet up in the air. He's like 3,000 meters up in the air, and this vulture flying along, cruising along, massive wingspan, comes and just lands on his feet, claps his wings, and just stands there for a little bit. And the guy's like patting its back and everything. Like, it's a profound video. Just type in paraglider and like vulture or eagle landing on feet. It's mind blowing.
Very nice, Mel. You could drop it in the show notes there. And the second half of the question was, is there a bucket list spot? Now, keep in mind, I have teased you a few times with pictures from Torrey Pines here of people paragliding over the beach. So that could be your answer. Then you can come down to meet for the first time.
Oh man, I'd love to make it down there especially to fly. But you know what? I would say the first time I ever went paragliding, I was paragliding in Nepal in maybe like 2010, earlier than that, maybe like 2008. I was paragliding in Nepal, and at the time I was just a teenager, and I wasn't paragliding as like a solo pilot. I was just doing a tandem with a guide, and it's the first time I ever flew. And I remember the mountains, being in the Himalayas and seeing like the huge like 8,000 meter peaks, which would be like 30,000 foot peaks, is just one of the most profound experiences. And that was the first time, and I definitely find one of the challenges with tandem for me is I get really nauseous when I'm not in control. I've only ever done a tandem flight twice, and both times were thrown up. And so I'm like cruising up in these thermals, and we're going up and up and up, and I'm speaking to this like a guide who's like, he's American. And I was like, so do people like throw up off these gliders? And he was like, oh yeah, if you ever feel like you're going to throw up, just let me know. And I was just like, so what do they do? And he was just like, you just tell me and I'll just lean off, and I'll just kind of bank it in, and you can just like lean off the side. And I was like, I'm going to throw up, and just straight off watch it disperse. And so that's my first experience and only experience in Nepal, and I'd love to go back and actually fly and hopefully not throw up.
There you go. Well, we'll need to see the pictures in the video when that does happen. Icebreaker number 2. So like I mentioned, you are an author. If you were talking to a room of kids that wanted to be future authors, what's the top tip you would give them?
So you know what? I would say write not to make money. Write to kind of really try to distill down what it is that you're passionate about. I find writing is such an incredible tool to understand the world. And when you do start writing, at first it can be incredibly daunting, but the more you kind of persevere, the more you start to like deepen your understanding of what your beliefs are. and you start to be able to articulate what your beliefs are more accurately. And so I find that when you step back and you don't try to put anything out there, you don't try to like force a book, you don't try to make money from it, and you write from a place of passion and you write from a place of curiosity and inquisitiveness, I find that's when you kind of produce your best work. And so for me, all of the content that I write has always been about, does this thing inspire me? Well, I'm going to write about it. I have a blog called the Qi of Self-Sovereignty, which kind of in traditional Chinese medicine, Qi is like our life force energy. So it's kind of the blog about our life force energy and being a sovereign being. Initially, I started doing it on like a weekly schedule. And the challenge I felt was that after about, I don't know, maybe 20, 30 episodes, I was just getting so bored of just like, okay, it's Wednesdays, I've got to release an episode and I was a post. So I just started writing about something. I kind of lost that desire and that drive to write because I was just writing for the sake of writing. And so I find that when you step back and you write because you're passionate about something, it comes so much more naturally. You get into that flow state and it just makes such a big difference. When you're passionate, you're so much more motivated to tweak and edit and kind of really present your best ideas.
Yep, that's probably can carry that through not only to writing, but for those kids that are parents that are out there, kind of, anything they're interested in, find the passion, and let them explore it. But for sure with writing,
100%. And you know what? Like, so as you mentioned, like I don't currently have a kid. My partner has a 6-year-old kid, but I would love to have kids. And I've worked a lot in the school district. I used to run kids programs. And what I've really noticed as well is it's like when kids are in this traditional school system and it's like, cool, you've got to do a project, but this is the topic you're doing the project on. It's very hard for that kid to find that motivation. Whereas the moment you're just like, okay, you know what? You're allowed to do a project on whatever it is that really motivates you in this moment, that you see the like fuel in the ignition in the kid's eyes when he feels like he can direct his energy towards something he's passionate about. And I find that our brain learns when we find something engaging and interesting, as opposed to just being boxed into kind of like a corner.
Yep, no, that, and I guess maybe I can toss in a side tip from a homeschool parent. So our daughter, one of her least favorite things is handwriting, and so getting her to do handwriting is quite a task. But to your point, one of the ways that we often do it is, let's say we went to the zoo or we're out doing something, come back and have her start writing about what just happened is much more enjoyable, rather than sit down and copy these sentences or whatever it is. So similar to what you're saying. So for those homeschool parents out there, if you're struggling with handwriting or that sort of stuff, go take them to the zoo, take them to SeaWorld, take them to the beach, whatever it is, have them write about the experience and then see where that gets you. Perfect. Well, icebreaker number 3, sticking kind of with the adventure theme back to that. You're also into mountain biking, I know. What's the worst fall you ever had?
Touch wood. You know what? Although my lifestyle is very much sport. Like I mountain bike and I paraglide and I ski tour and I rock climb and I just love being in nature. I love being able to experience different environments from different perspectives, whether it's on the rock face or whether it's up in the mountains or up in the air. I've always actually been a very cautious person. Like my whole life I've been very, very cautious. And that has served me, and I feel really lucky because I have many friends that when they're mountain biking, it's either like full like gung-ho 100% and they injure themselves all the time and then they're out. Whereas for me, although my progression may have been slower, I tend to not injure myself too often. I would say a lot of my injuries have probably been when I've been younger, and a lot of my injuries, to be 100% honest, have been when I've least expected it. Like I broke my ankle walking my dog a few years back just by like rolling it off of a route, and I was not paying attention. But I would say, you know what, when I was, how old was I? Maybe around 12 years old, I was trying to do what's called like a Superman, which is where like you hit a jump, you're up in the air, and then you push the bike out in front of you and you kick your legs behind you. So you're kind of extending yourself out straight, similar to kind of the Superman shape. And I remember as I was kicking myself out, my legs out backwards and bringing them back in, I caught them on the tire. And it meant that from like 15, 20 feet up in the air, I kind of like threw myself off on a weird angle and I landed right on the knuckle of the jump on my tailbone and ended up kind of fracturing my tailbone. And that was probably the most painful. That was so unbelievably painful. And for years, and I'm talking like almost a decade, if I was flying, not paragliding, just flying like even in a plane, if I had to sit for long periods of time, it hurt. And so that I've only in the last like 5 or 6 years started to not notice that too much. But I wonder, like even though I'm only 32 years old, I do get back pain. And I'm like, did that start then? you know.
You'll never know, but we can blame it on the fall. Yes, back injuries are not fun at all. Well, keep staying safe on that side of things. And icebreaker number 4, is there a quirky habit or superstition that you have that makes people laugh when you share it?
I I have a fear of cold eggs. I have a fear of cold eggs. I have when I was about 8 years old, we went down to like the corner store, and of course, as kids, you buy a whole bunch of candy. And my best friend, we were standing outside of the corner store, and he's like, Seb, I've got a whole bunch of different candies. Close your eyes and open your mouth, and I'm going to put a candy, and you got to tell me which type of candy it is. And I was like, okay, this sounds perfect. So I close my eyes, open my mouth, and he shoves a cold, hard-boiled egg in my mouth. And I remember just like, I was young. I burst into tears, threw my lunch on the floor, and like ran away. And then later that week or something, someone threw a hard-boiled egg at me at school. And since then, I've struggled with hard-boiled eggs. In India, when I was a teenager, I was on like a warm, hot bus. We'd been on this bus for like 14 hours. And the lady in front of me just pulls out like a Tupperware container of like hard-boiled eggs. And I'm like, we've been on here for 14 hours and it's like 35 degrees. It's like friggin' 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And these things must be off. And I remember the smell wafting over me, and then I threw up over the back of the seat. And so I'm not a cold, hard-boiled egg person. Does not interest me.
I'd have to say this is probably the first time we've gone through the icebreakers with 2 throw-up stories. So we're hitting some records here. I'm not a hard-boiled egg person either, so we can commiserate on that.
What is it like? Does anyone ever turn the question around on you? Like, if there's something that you have not shared or something that's unique about you, like, what would you say?
A quirky habit. So when I go to the Padre games, when I'm leaving, there's a certain kind of railing above your head. You're like in a walkway, and so there's a walkway above you. And as I'm leaving, I touch it twice. So a little superstitions like that. A lot of my superstitions are around sports, though. Like if something's good happening, don't change your shirt, or don't put a jacket on. That sort of stuff is probably the most common one. That'd probably be my answer.
There's a book by Nassim Taleb, like the philosopher mathematician, and a lot of people know him for a book called Black Swan, but he's got another book called Fooled by Randomness. And one of the things he talks about in there, he's just like, you know what? Like, if you've got a superstition that works for you, then absolutely, by all means, keep doing that thing. Because if it's helping you manifest a reality that betters your position, that's freaking amazing. But at the same time, if you have a superstition that doesn't work for you, then stop believing in that thing. And that, like, one of the analogies he gives, or one of the studies he talks about, is how even birds will have superstitions. And so they've found that if you have a little food dispenser with a button, and the bird learns that when he presses the button, it dispenses food, if you suddenly turn that button into an intermittent button, where sometimes it dispenses food and sometimes it doesn't, they've found many birds will try different things, like doing a little rain dance to try and see when the food comes out. And they get into these little superstitions that think certain actions of theirs are causing the food to come out. And so I think we're naturally just like superstitious beings. Like, we want to believe there's something bigger.
That is true. We do have 2 birds in our house, so I can ask Charlotte if she wants to try those tricks with the birds and report back for everybody. Okay, last icebreaker. What's the most random skill you've picked up that has been surprisingly come in handy in your life?
You know what? I really struggled in school. I dropped out of school when I was 14 years old. School was not my thing. I've really struggled and thought for a long, long, long time that I was just like, I was slow, I was thick, whatever you want to kind of label it as. I didn't fit in. I didn't really get good grades in school, not because I wasn't trying, but it just did not engage me. It's kind of like what we are talking about earlier. When we write about things we're interested in, we get into that flow state, and I just wasn't interested in school, and so I struggled. I was also, as a kid, diagnosed with ADHD, and I think that didn't help with school. But once I left school, I really found my flow. And if there was a subject that I was interested in, I could really kind of dive in and get into this flow state. And I can be in that flow state for weeks at a time. And I can absolutely like rapid consume content with like really high retention. But it took me a long time to figure this out. And so this is where I think sometimes in society today, we talk a lot about how like ADHD, people are distracted. And it's like, no, they're distracted because they're not interested. But ADHD is also a superpower. And so when you find yourself interested in something, holy, it's just like supercharged learning. So now I know the feeling internally when I find something that I'm passionate about, and that feeling that, hey, if I dedicate energy to this, I can rapid learn. And so that is what I've done for like Bitcoin over the years. It's what I've done for mountain biking. It's what I've done for paragliding. It's what I've done for understanding our monetary system. I trained to be a somatic therapist. It's what I've done for understanding psychology and childhood trauma. Like all of these things, like when I find something I'm interested in, I'll go and just burn through countless books. And like to give one quicker example, like I ended up a little while back, I was dating a runner, and she used to do kind of ultra long distance marathons. And at the time, I'd never run in my life. And because I was dating her, I was just like, man, I want to understand a little more about running. And so then I went and read like 10 books on running, all about like the fitness of like how the body works and adenosine triphosphate and like the metabolic system and like how to maximize aerobic activity and fitness. And so when I get into something, I can like supercharge my ADHD and direct it towards these things. And it's phenomenal.
That's a perfect way to think about something. Like you said, many times people think of as something that might hinder you, but you flip the script to be able to put it to your benefit. Well, awesome with the icebreaker. And that was a perfect lead in with your answer there to kind of the first question in the next section here, just kind of getting to know you and your childhood. So correct me if I'm wrong, you grew up in New Zealand, then moved to Canada. And so can you walk us through kind of what your childhood was like and kind of that move from New Zealand to Canada?
Totally. And so I'm going to add one more step there. I was born in the UK. I was born in London. Then my mum's a New Zealander. My dad's British. And then we moved to New Zealand. And then eventually I realized I was like, man, the mountains, I want to be in the mountains. I want to be mountain biking. It was my first true love. And then I moved to Canada. But what I would say has really, when I look back at my childhood, what profoundly shaped who I am was the fact that when I was about 5 years old, my parents separated. And they separated for differences and various things. But what it meant is that I was raised by my mum, a single mum. And because I was raised by my mum, she basically had to put food on the table and a roof over our heads. And I had two brothers, and we used to live in a small little 2-bedroom house. And because of our monetary system, because of the challenges at which she faced monetarily, she wasn't able to show up for us to the extent she might have liked to emotionally. And so this is only something that kind of going into my 20s, reflecting on my childhood, I realized how much of a role money played in my mum's ability to be able to show up and support us emotionally. And so this is, I think, one of the reasons why I became so passionate about talking about Bitcoin, talking about money, talking about the impact of money on our parental bonds and how it shapes who we are and how we show up. And so I was kind of raised with a single mum. I spent a lot of time in my childhood just in the forest with my friends because my mum was working. And I think that gave me the independence and the curiosity of trying to like figure things out myself. But I feel really lucky to have also had that childhood, because I think that childhood is what laid the foundation for having, that curiosity, as I said, and trying to like piece together how the world works. And I'd say that there was one event, and I write about this in my book, The Hidden Cost of Money. There's one event that really stood out to me that I think, again, laid the foundation for understanding Bitcoin. And that event was when I was about 9 years old. I'd like saved up for the scooter. I wanted this scooter so badly. You've probably heard this story before, Scott, but I like wanted the scooter. So two brothers and I, my dad was between kind of like creating value, saving hard and buying and rewarding yourself, and socialism being handed something. And what's interesting is when I look at how my brothers have evolved over time, both of my brothers are very left-leaning, socialist, and kind of lean on intervention, and I lean a lot more free market. But I think that it was that situation that made me question, like, why does the world feel unfair? What is it about like money and how it shapes who we are? And so I think that small little event really had a profound impact on my childhood and how I thought about the world around me.
You are correct. I did remember that story. Actually, it was one of my questions here to have you bring up. So I'm glad you jumped on it on your own. Actually, the one part I had wrong, I thought it was a bike and not a scooter. So I got that part wrong in my memory. But yes, no, I remembered you telling me that probably years ago. Who knows when that was, to have kind of part of the conversation, since I knew it was part of what kind of helped turn you into who you are. Do you ever think about what you might have been like today had your parents not been divorced? So in some ways, yes, it was tough to go through that, but looking back now, you were able to learn a lot of different lessons. Do you think it would have shaped you differently if you came from called a typical two-parent household?
Absolutely. I briefly mentioned it earlier, but I went down the rabbit hole of wanting to become a somatic therapist for a while. So for those that aren't familiar with a somatic therapist, again, we're helping with people with trauma, moving through that trauma. somatic is kind of like the sensory body. And so it's just like many times we believe that trauma, we can't just talk through it. There's always two stories when it comes to going through a traumatic event. There is the cognitive story, which is what we experienced and what we remember. And then there is the sensory kind of nervous system story, which is what our body remembers. So somatic therapy is all about how do we move through that trauma on the sensory body. And so anyway, I would say that my passion for kind of diving into trauma and understanding how we show up and how our upbringing shape who we are has come from the fact that as a child, I didn't really feel like I had my emotional needs met. And so I've always been seeking, how do I meet those emotional needs? How do I kind of build that relationship with my inner child? And I think that has only come about because I was raised by a single mum. And so I think that if I had been raised by both parents, if both parents had been able to be there to meet my emotional needs, I wouldn't have gone down that rabbit hole of trying to fix or resolve those challenges that I grew up with or my own insecurities. And I think as a result of that, I wouldn't have been maybe questioning the world around me to the same extent, and I wouldn't have pieced together the dots between money and the parent-child bond and how we show up on an emotional, psychological level. And so I wouldn't change anything. I feel really lucky to have had the upbringing that I have, and my mum is one of my best friends, and I've rebuilt my relationship with my dad. So I feel really lucky to have had this upbringing because I think it's laid the foundation for where I am now.
That makes complete sense. For anybody, I'm sure there's some parents out there who maybe are single parents or have their kids that are potentially going through a divorce. Is there any tips that you would talk to those parents to say, hey, this is what, as a child that came from divorce, worked for our family, but that didn't? Like, what tips would you give them to be able to say, your kids are going to be okay, but here's some tips to make those kids kind of go through that situation in a smoother process, if you will?
Man, that's such a tough one. I think and again, I'm speaking from someone who doesn't necessarily have their own kids. This is coming from my own research. This is coming from kind of what I've experienced. But what I've found, especially working in the school district with kids, being able to work with families, being able to kind of all of the resources of which I've dove into, I think that we have a society where there's a lot of shame around certain emotions, whether those emotions are sadness, whether those emotions are anger. And there's no such thing as a bad emotion. There's unhealthy ways of expressing that emotion, but there's no such thing as a bad emotion. And I think that what I really want to kind of pass down to my kids and what I really try to pass down to the kids I work with is that I want to express any emotions that I'm feeling, but trying to do so in healthy ways. So when I'm frustrated, when I'm sad, showing those kids that I'm feeling those things. And those kids then learn to be able to experience the world through a full set of emotions. And that's really important because I think that when we take a step back and ask ourselves, what is depression? Well, depression, if you actually break down the word, is the depressing of emotions. It's when our parents didn't allow us to feel sadness or didn't allow us to feel anger because, those are bad emotions. You just need to be happy. You just need to be cheerful. We don't want to see those negative emotions. And so as a child, we kind of grow up thinking those are negatives. We suppress them when we feel them. And as an adult, when we're feeling this sadness, when we're feeling this frustration, when we're feeling this anger, we don't know how to feel those things or express those things because we never learned how. And it results in depression. It results in this kind of free-floating anxiety. Why am I feeling the way that I'm feeling? And so I think that if there's one thing that's profoundly changed my life, and I've noticed has had an impact on the kids that I work with, it's being vocal about how we feel, but teaching kids how to express it in healthy ways. So being able to say, look, you know what? I feel frustrated right now. This action made me feel this way, and I'm not going to deny that I'm feeling this way. But there's a difference between the kid going out and punching the other kid or expressing that he feels angry about an action that took place. And so that has made a big difference in my life.
It's definitely an extremely valuable tip, especially speaking as a parent. It's not an easy one. When you see your child upset about something or somebody hurt their feelings or whatnot, your first instinct is to try to smooth it over in ways that may not be true or whatnot. But I know, like you said, it's not the best action. You want to let them go through that process to learn from it, as hard as it may be looking at it happening from the outside. So no, those are awesome tips.
Totally. And I was going to mention one thing as well, which is I remember this book that I was reading a while back, and it said one of the emotions, one of the feelings that has made us who we are as humans is actually shame. Shame is a very important emotion because what shame does is if we perform an action that is not socially acceptable and someone voices, hey, that kind of action is not on, and we feel shame, that discomfort that arises from shame is what allows us to actually change our behavior in order to be able to fit into our social group, our social peers, to be able to set those boundaries, to be able to understand what is acceptable and what is not. And so I think that as parents, being able to, it's not that we want this healthy shame and unhealthy shame. You don't want to like ridicule our kids or make them feel less than, but when our kids perform actions which are not acceptable, being able to voice that in a calm, collected voice and to be able to express that, hey, I still love you. That's not changing, but there's certain actions that like they're going to hurt other people or the repercussions of those actions are. And it's the result of that shame that actually creates change in the individual.
Very well said there. And you mentioned prior to that, a little bit about you've worked in the schools, throughout time. What surprised you most about kind of the education system in general, and how did interacting with kids there kind of shape your views on learning and child development, being able to see it firsthand on that side of things?
Oh, I'd say that working in the school district made me realize that our current school system is not built for curiosity. Our current school system is very much built for conformity and structured. How would I word it? It's kind of built to create a labor workforce. I think that like when you go back through history and you look at like where do we come from? Where did this educational system develop from? And it's kind of like from the Victorian era when we were really trying to create a labor workforce to fill a lot of the factories. And so what we needed shift work. People were basically going to start on the clock and they would have to do the same repetitive behavior over and over and over again. And maybe the alarm goes and then they go and shift and go do some other repetitive behavior. And so the school system was built in order to be able to have kids come into school and then they start and they've got to do some form of behavior for a period of time. Then the alarm goes and they go on to the next behavior. And it's all about kind of like listening to superiors, and it doesn't give kids the ability to explore, to be curious, to kind of like tread their own path. And so I worked in the school district for a while, and then I realized I was just like, this is not the environment that I feel like kids need. And for every parent that has a homeschool kid, when I meet that kid, oh my God, their depths of curiosity, the depth of knowledge is just far superior. And the depth of an emotional intelligence, because they're just being in very different environments, has just been phenomenal. And so the school district really opened my eyes to the importance of homeschooling, or at least being in a school environment that supports curiosity, supports kids being able to ask questions, supports kids being able to dive into the topics that interest them most.
Yep. And in a lot of your writings, you talk about kind of the importance of having that strong parental attachment for brain maturation and emotional regulation. How do you kind of see the modern education system really supporting or hindering, most likely, that process?
So I think it's really interesting. Like when we actually step back, there's countless tribes or kind of groups that have passed down knowledge for thousands of years. And you ask, well, what do they all have in common? And what they have in common is that kids are spending time with multiple generations of individuals, whether it's the older teenagers, whether it is their parents, whether it is the grandparents. And it's when we spend time across generations that we start to see how people act differently, the knowledge at which they pass down, our knowledge about our local environment, our culture. And so I think that being able to spend time across generations is absolutely vital to a functioning economy. It's absolutely vital to having an identity as a community. And I think the challenge that we face today is that as money is breaking down and parents are having to work more, kids are spending more time with their peers. And peer relationships are very different to these parental, grandparental relationships, where instead of this knowledge being passed down and these morals and these values being passed down and this kind of like guiding North Star being kind of in place, instead, kids, because of our attachment dynamics, we want to attach to a community. If we're not attaching to our parents, we attach to our peers. But peers, we're all entering this world at the same time. We're all exploring with limited understanding of the world around us. And so instead, we want to conform. We want to look the same. We want to sound the same. We want to dress the same. We have the same mannerisms. And so this is what you see in society today. All of the kids look identical. There's no individuation. Kids don't know what their boundaries are. They don't know what it is that they value because they're simply just trying to fit in. And I think that this is why I would argue that we have massive rising rates in conjunction with other things, but we have massive rising rates of mental health issues, depression, anxiety, stress. We're seeing rising substance abuse. We're seeing rising rates of suicide. And I think all of this is stemming from the fact that kids don't know who they are. They don't know how to fit in. They're simply just trying to merge in with the mass of their kind of local community. And what's interesting is you can see this in the data in terms of like the average parent from the 1970s to present day. Well, in the 1970s, it was very easy for a single parent or a single earner to be able to support a whole family. what we've seen since then is a doubling of dual earner households, both parents having to go out and work, and we've seen a halving of single earner households. So both parents are out working and kids are spending a lot less time with their parents. And I think that makes just such a huge difference. And one other thing that I'll just quickly mention, it's a slight tangent. I just recently read a book that completely blew me away, so I'd highly, highly recommend reading it. Any parents that are listening to this, it's a book called what is it called? The Anxious Generation. And this book basically just discusses this idea that kids today don't have that same independence. Kids are wanting to conform. They don't know who they are. They've got these rising mental health issues, anxiety, you name it. And much of that is also, it's not only because of our monetary systems, which I speak about, but it's also because of our technology. And I think because of our technology, kids aren't ever spending time in contemplation and boredom, which is where they think about themselves, they look inwards and they reflect. Instead, they're constantly distracted by all of this technology. And there was this really interesting kind of telling moment in the book where the author basically says he was at this conference and there's about 10,000 people in the crowd. And he says, okay, everyone who is a baby boomer and older, so I think this is around kind of like the late 60s, early 70s and older, on 3, you're going to say what your liberation age was. And to him, he calls the liberation age the age at which you felt like you had a little autonomy. You could go out into the forest with your friends. You didn't need supervision. It was kind of unstructured play. What was your liberation age? And he's like 1, 2, 3. And all of the baby boomer and older said like 5, 6, 7. That was the liberation age when they could go and explore on their own. And then he says, okay, the Generation Z, so this is like 97, kids born in 97 and younger, on 3, what was your liberation age? And they're like 13, 14, 15. That's a huge difference. That's a huge difference. And I think it's because today, kids they're spending far too much time just with their peers. They're not learning to individuate. They're not learning to be independent. And then at the same time, we've got all of this technology playing a role in this where parents, because of all of the news, because of we're getting global news, we're seeing everything that's going on in the world. We're so fearful of what's going to happen to our kids, even though crime has dropped since the 70s. So I think the world's a really, really interesting place right now. And I think, to me, I think Bitcoin solves a lot of this.
It definitely does. Another thing that, along these lines that you talk about in some of your writings is how being super focused on goals and just constant goal setting can stop the ability for people to let them have life come to them and kind of go through that process. And you're just always focused, get there, onto the next thing, onto the next thing. And that could be true for adults or kids. But when it comes to parents, you're probably constantly trying to set that goal setting. If you're talking to parents, how would you try to tell them to say, hey, let's try to step back from always constantly trying to set a goal for your kid and let life come to the kid at the same time to try to broaden their horizons?
Totally. I think maybe I'll start by kind of sharing my own personal experience and then kind of bring it back to the childhood side of things. Goal setting is something that I think all of us have a bit of a relationship with. And I've noticed that in my first kind of teenage years going into my 20s, goal setting was important. And I'm not saying that there's no value in goal setting. I think to be able to kind of somewhat figure out what it is that I value and what kind of trajectory do I want to be on? How do I create that motivation? I think goal setting is a good start where it's kind of like, okay, you know what? I want to kind of get this job, or maybe I want to get this qualification, or maybe I want to kind of get to this level and this skill. And by setting those goals, it really gives us a bit of a framework at which to achieve that. And that's phenomenal. It gets us started. It kickstarts that momentum. And I used to set goals with everything, with my career, with my relationships. And then what I noticed is that by setting goals, we actually box ourselves in because we can only set goals from the world view at which we're looking at right now. And so I can't set a goal at something which I never could anticipate. And so kind of when the pandemic hit, I decided I was like, you know what? I'm going to step back from setting goals and I'm going to let the world unfold. And at the time, I was a backcountry mountain bike instructor. I worked for a mountain bike company and I loved it. But I also had a passion for kind of education and teaching about the complexities of the world and money. So I decided at the start of the pandemic just to start writing about money. I'd never planned this. I'd never set a goal. If I tried to set goals, I would have been like, well, I want a job in the mountain bike industry, or I want to kind of teach more clients, or I want to teach better clients. I would never have been able to say that I'm now kind of teaching on the world stage, speaking at all of these Bitcoin conferences and meeting the most fascinating individuals. I could never have set goals for that. And so by actually stepping back, once I'd found my momentum in my career, by stepping back and allowing the world to unfold and just directing my energy towards whatever it is I'm passionate about in that moment, I find that you find yourself in really unique positions. You meet the most interesting individuals, and you really have these such incredible experiences. And so kind of transitioning that to parents, I think what's really important, and again, this is what it talks about in this Anxious Generation book, is that today we want our kids to be the best version of themselves. So what do? Oh, we put them in soccer, and then we go and put them in volleyball, and then we go and put them in gymnastics. And then so from the moment the kid wakes up, he maybe goes to soccer practice, then he goes to school and he has all of this structured time throughout school, and then he gets home from school and then he goes on to whatever, hockey practice or gymnastics. And then he gets home and then you feed them, then you let them watch a little bit of iPad, and then they go to sleep. And so throughout that whole time, the kid has had structure the whole day, and there's been no ability for that kid to be able to wander in his mind, to be able to use his imagination. And so what has changed significantly since the 60s and 70s to present day, so structured play has gone up and up and up and up and up, and unstructured play has gone down and down and down and down and down. But what's interesting is, where do we develop that sense of self? Where do we develop our risk tolerance? Where do we develop our curiosity? Where do we develop who are we and how do we want to show up and what is it that we value? Well, we develop that in unstructured play. We don't develop it in structured play. When we're in this unstructured play, when we're entering into this world and we're creating our own entertainment, that's where we let the mind wander. That's when we push ourselves and try to figure out what our boundaries and limitations are. And that is where we individuate. And so I'd say that one of the challenges we face today is we're trying to structure everything, whether it's through goal setting or just trying to structure the day. And we're not allowing kids to be able to have that free, unstructured time to be able to figure out who they are. And there's an interesting chart in this book that talks about how what we've seen over time is actually the amount of time parents think they're spending with their kids has dropped off significantly, and while the actual amount of time parents are spending with their kids has increased. And so we've got this weird dynamic where parents are sometimes spending more time with their kids, but they think they're spending less time. And I think the difference is a parent may be inside making dinner while the kid is having unstructured play in the forest around the house, and they're still feeling connected, and then the kid comes back in and they have deep conversation. And so because of that, the parent feels like, man, the kid is out there and he's learning and he's individuating, and they don't feel guilty about it. Whereas today, parents can be spending time with their kids, but the kid is on the iPad, the parent is on on their iPhone. They're right next to each other. They spend 5 hours together, but there's been almost no interaction. And so I find we've got this weird dynamic going on as a result of technology, as a result of the financial pressures, as a result of all of these other kind of factors.
All extremely key points. And it reminds me, another quote I had pulled out from one of the articles you wrote was from David Graeber. I'll read it to make sure I get it right. So you said, there's this quote from David, the real question now is to move forward in a society where people can live more by working less. And I think that ties into kind of what you're saying, where, have that free play, have that time together. I know you wrote a longer piece kind of centered around that quote. Maybe talk a little bit about how that concept ties into everything.
Totally. And this is maybe where I think like the foundation of Bitcoin comes in. I think when our money is slowly losing purchasing power over time, it gives us less and less capacity to show up and direct our energy towards whatever it is that matters most to us, whether that is kind of directing energy towards our community, whether it is directing energy towards what we're passionate about, our sports and our hobbies, whether that is our family and our kids, or to be honest, it can even just be our career, not because we want to make money, but because we're interested in it. And so I think that as our money is degrading, we spend more time trying to survive and put food on the table and a roof over our heads, and less time directing energy towards what motivates us and what really kind of like fills our cup. And so I think that when you have Bitcoin, which is the inverse of the monetary system we have today, where we have a finite supply, which means as society improves in productivity and efficiency, prices fall over time, so life starts to get easier. It becomes easier to put a roof over our heads. It becomes easier to put food on the table. It means that we have more capacity. And I think that capacity is huge. Like if as an individual you have more capacity, then you can start to ask yourself questions around like, who am I and how do I want to show up? Like, what is it that really kind of like gets me up in the morning? And if that is like kids, and you want to really dedicate that time and energy to building a family and spending time with your kids, you have more capacity to do that. And that's where what I absolutely love about the Bitcoin community is you go along to these events, and I'm sure you can speak to it as well. You go to these like conferences, and if you went to a traditional financial conference, it's probably guys between the age of 30 and 60, and that's it. You go to a Bitcoin conference, and it's everyone from babies all the way through to elderly people from all different backgrounds, religions, races, you name it. And everyone just has this common goal of just like, how do we have more capacity? How do we create a world where we can thrive? And so I love it. And I'm noticing, like, I live in an area called the Sea to Sky, which is from Vancouver up to Whistler in Canada here. And unfortunately, because it's a really incredible area with amazing mountains, there's a lot of demand. And property prices are unbelievably expensive. Cost of living is unbelievably expensive. And so it means that people aren't thinking about family. No one is wanting to have kids. The millennial generation, like, essentially, I have very few friends that have kids. And so it's really hard to meet people that you want to, like, kind of share a life with, build a family. What I find amazing about the Bitcoin community is you go along to these events and everyone wants to have kids. Everyone's having more kids. And so I would say that capacity in the financial realm is leading to people thinking about the future, thinking about having a family because they have the resources to do so. Whereas in the fiat realm, where money is breaking down and cost of living is rising, it's the opposite. People aren't thinking about the future. They're simply thinking about meeting their impulsive needs.
Yep. Kind of that high time preference, which actually brings us on to a nice transition for the next topic that I had here. There's probably many parents out there that are listening. Maybe they have the older set of kids. They're teenagers. They're going into potentially kind of that first dating period, which I'm sure is a stressful time as a parent. As someone, you're in a relationship now, but I know I've heard you on interviews in the past talk about kind of living through the current mold of that high time preference, kind of dating life, the apps that are out there, that sort of stuff. Maybe, from your perspective, how do you think parents should kind of prepare their kids to kind of go down that process to, start dating for those first time? Not only that, but when modern technology makes it so crazy and unexpected.
Man, that's a really, really good question. And I'll kind of bring it back to, like, capacity again. I think that what I'm noticing with Bitcoin is that as you've got more capacity and the parents are spending more time with their kids, as I spoke about previously, kids are starting to individuate and they're figuring out who they are and how they want to show up and what their boundaries are and what their values are. And what I'm noticing is that, like, in the modern world today, unfortunately, people are just trying to meet impulsive needs. They're just trying to fit in. They're really kind of suppressing the self. And so I think that it's kind of leading up to those teenage years where they're starting to enter into the dating world, by being able to kind of adopt a bit of like a Bitcoin mindset and thinking about the world from a place of prosperity, thinking long term. I think kids are better able to understand how they want to show up. So once they even just enter the world of dating, they're in such a more grounded foundation. And I think they're not swayed. They're not willing to just, the first hint of someone interested in them, they're just going to, like, dive on this person, even if that person doesn't fully align. And so I'm noticing this in the Bitcoin world as people are so much more sure of themselves, and it is supporting them in reducing that stress and that anxiety, that heartbreak when they do face rejection, or when a relationship is not going the way they anticipated. They're able to stay true to what it is that they believe in. And so I would just say, like, going back to, like, parents who are able to have more capacity to support their kids and to be able to set that foundation where kids are able to individuate and understand themselves are faring way better in the world of dating today, simply because they have that foundation to build from, as opposed to kind of being lost and being impulsive and just trying to fit in.
That makes sense. And kind of tying it into the kind of the Bitcoin financial aspect, on this side of things, you've mentioned in the past how kind of in relationships you've seen people have maybe fast tracked certain milestones, like maybe moving in together, because, hey, it's gonna save us $500 a month, or it's gonna save us XYZ. So kind of fast tracking milestones that maybe they weren't prepared for. How has the economic pressure influenced dating and kind of the people you've seen that happen to, and what can people do to avoid those pitfalls?
Totally. Man, I think that's absolutely key point, which is, unfortunately, when we face these financial pressures, we're willing to kind of, like, shortcut our needs or kind of the long-term goals to actually build a foundation, simply because we don't have any other means to be able to survive. And so, like, people, unfortunately, and I see it all the time, like, they move in together within like 3 months because they can't afford to pay rent in 2 different locations. So then they kind of lean into a relationship that maybe their needs aren't being met, or they're kind of dishonest with themselves about whether that relationship actually fulfills their needs, because they've got to think about finances first and foremost. And I'm hoping there's a builder upstairs who seems to be drilling. Hopefully you don't hear it in the background.
You're good.
So I would just say, like, Bitcoin has really profoundly is changing how people are showing up, because when someone is comfortable in themselves somewhat financially, they don't need to be in the position they want to be in the future right now. But if they know that they have the means to get to that point, I find it gives them much more capacity to pause and reflect on what their needs are in any given moment. And I've noticed that for me, like, since getting into the world of Bitcoin, I'm so much more conscious about, like, where do I want to direct my energy in terms of my job? Do I want to just be doing a job for the sake of making money? Or do I want to be doing a job that actually I feel like I'm able to create value in this world? And I feel like I'm able to lean into something that is making a difference. And so Bitcoin has given me the capacity to be able to reflect on these things, which I otherwise would not have been able to do so underneath a fiat world.
And you mentioned earlier that you're currently in a relationship and your partner has a 6-year-old. What's kind of been that like in kind of your figuring out your proper role and kind of not only dating your significant other, but also being a figure in that other child's life, and kind of how have you gone about that?
You know what? So we've been dating now for it's basically since the start of this year, and we actually dated at the start of 2020 when the kid was under 1 year old, and so being able to see the kid now 6 years on and seeing the kid under one, it's a really, really interesting experience. One thing that has become like very apparent to me is just like seeing separated parents, especially when they've got different parenting styles. Oh man, it is unbelievably hard. And so I'm trying to find this balance right now. And this is the hardest thing in the relationship, is trying to find this balance of, I want to support this kid as much as I can, but I don't want to step on anyone's toes. But I also see the world from a very different light as to like, this is, and do not get me wrong, I think my partner is the most incredible individual and I feel so lucky. But I see someone who's been a single mum who was kind of pushed into this situation where she's had to survive financially. And the ex-partner is also kind of like living underneath his parents and having to survive financially. And so they're making decisions that they have to make in the moment, as opposed to the decision that they think is best in the long term. And so I'm coming into this and I feel very lucky to come from a grounded place where I'm in an okay financial position where I can support myself. So I can see these bigger pictures. And so being able to find out as we're growing together, how we're merging how we view the world from this kind of place of capacity. And what I hope is that we're able to create this foundation where we can support the kid, and maybe the kid feels like it can show up more authentically because we have the capacity and the tools to do so, as opposed to just reacting in life, which is currently what has taken place for quite a while.
Are there any, over the past, almost year, I guess 8 months or so, kind of going back into life, what are some of the special memories you guys have together, kind of building a family from afar, if you will, kind of any activities you guys enjoy doing together?
It's, you know what, like we initially, so we started dating in 2020. And I think I shared with you before we started the podcast, which was we dated and we've really tried to make it work. So there's something really special about this person. I think they're phenomenal and I feel really lucky. And the challenge was that she lives 6 hours away from me. And at the time, my identity was very much wrapped up in the mountains where I live. And she lives down south in Victoria at the bottom of Vancouver Island. And it's much more of kind of a suburbia. And I've never in my life been able to see myself living in a city. And there was a period where she may have moved to where I live. And so that's why we were like, okay, let's try and make this work. And then we couldn't really quite decide where we're going to live. So it didn't unfortunately work. But what has been so cool is that because we spent that time together when the kid was under 1 year old, we've got all of these pictures of the kid as a baby. And now the kid is 6 years old. And just recently we were spending time, we're looking through old pictures, and the kid was just blown away because the kid is recognizing that, holy, I've spent a lot of time with this guy. And we've got all of these pictures of the little kid when he was 1 year old, and he's just blown away, absolutely blown away. He was like, is that me? And is that me? And is that me? And so it's just so cute being able to see kind of the evolution and for that kid to recognize that I've been in his life earlier on. And so I'm just really excited about the future, and we'd love to have a couple more kids of our own. And yeah, I just feel really lucky. And I wouldn't be here, honestly, if it wasn't for Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin has given me hope, and it's given me the ability to think big and think about my future.
How much conversation have you had with your partner and even with the child about Bitcoin and homeschooling and that side of things?
It's, you know what, like Bitcoin is so unique, as you know, in that because Bitcoin gives us capacity, it gives us the ability to be curious. And when we're curious, we start to realize that maybe the current system doesn't support us in the ways that I thought it did. Maybe it's really not the best for our kids. It doesn't support, as we've spoken about, like the curiosity and the really supporting the kid developing their intuition and independence and whatnot. And so I think that to me, it is very clear that I'd love to homeschool my kids. I'm also very conscious about like the food that I put in the kids and the pharmaceuticals we're using and just the environment to be able to like nurture that kid's brain during their like key developmental years. And so what I'm what I've noticed already is I've shared a lot of these resources, and it is a touchy subject. I've shared a lot of these resources with my partner, and she's like super receptive. But I think a lot of this time takes a lot of this knowledge, and assimilating this knowledge and understanding this knowledge and interacting with it. It takes time. And I don't think this is something that just happens overnight. And it also just makes me realize just how much, unfortunately, when we have limited capacity, we put off decision making onto the so-called experts. And we put that decision making onto the experts, we can be very swayed by propaganda. And so I think what Bitcoin has recognized is that when you dig into the educational system, the pharmaceutical system, and the health, the nutritional food side of things, it really is not supporting us. But it takes a lot of time and curiosity and energy to recognize that and recognize that maybe the experts don't have our best interests at heart. But it's just like, I urge anyone just to like step back and ask yourself, do I believe this thing because I've done the research to be able to articulate why that is the case? Or do I believe this thing because I've just been told that is the way that it is? And Bitcoin has given me the capacity, and I'm sure you as well, to actually start questioning my beliefs, questioning these things that I thought were true just because I've been told that's the way that it is.
Yep. And maybe sometimes you find out they are true.
Totally.
There's that side of it as well. Sometimes I think people put so much focus on the times they find something and it isn't true, which is extremely valuable, but there are times when it validates it. And then you can go on knowing that you're comfortable knowing that, hey, that was an accurate statement. Sticking kind of with the younger kids thing, a few years back, it's been 2 or 3 years ago now, you had the honor of going along with Julian to kind of set up a Shamri play experience with some kids and doing a video there. When you think about kind of what you saw and having those kids interact with, in this case, our game, but really Bitcoin in general, does that give you hope in knowing that kind of that next generation it'll be even easier for them to start learning these financial concepts as long as they're given the tools and given the ability to have access to learning about them?
I think that, like, when we think back to maybe our childhood, there was not a single class on what is money. We've never been told what is money. You go and speak to economists. You go and speak to people that have worked in the financial sector their whole life. They can't answer what is money. One of my good friends, who I've only just met this year, he worked in Hong Kong for like Goldman Sachs, quite high up. And I was speaking to him, and as I started sharing with him kind of a bit of the history of money and where Bitcoin sits, he honestly was just like, I had no idea. I had absolutely no idea. And this is someone who's worked with money his whole life. And so I think what is just so amazing about being in the room with like kindergarten kids, young kids, and starting to introduce them to money at a young age is, I think it profoundly shapes their experience, their relationship with money. And so I think kids are starting to think a lot more about how money impacts them. And maybe to give like a bit of an analogy, you may have heard of the Marshmallow Test. Have you ever heard of the Marshmallow Test? And so like, if you give a kid a marshmallow and say, you know what, you can eat the marshmallow today and you just get one marshmallow. Or if you save the marshmallow till tomorrow, you get another marshmallow. And what's interesting is the kids that have the capacity to save, there's countless psychological studies that have shown they end up having much better careers, better average pay, they have better health outcomes, like better like mindset. Like, there's so many studies that show the positive characteristics of kids that are able to put off reward into the future. And so I think what Bitcoin is doing is really setting that foundation, teaching kids about the importance of money, the importance of saving early on, that I think is laying that foundation for a more prosperous life long term.
For sure. And kind of along those lines, we didn't get into this in the conversation with Daz. It was too focused on his awesome travels. But for those parents out there that maybe have kids that are in that teenage on up age range, maybe talk a little bit about how Looking Glass and the education that's on the website could play a role for that age group and being able to dive into Bitcoin for the first time.
Totally. And so Looking Glass, like we really wanted to actually, when we first started building out Looking Glass, and for those that aren't familiar of what Looking Glass is, myself, Daz, Greg Foss, and a couple other amazing individuals, we founded Looking Glass as a way to be able to educate just a layperson who may not have experience in Bitcoin, but wants to understand more about Bitcoin, money, how our world intersects with money and how we show up. And so there's a whole bunch of free resources. There's also a bunch of different courses. And the main course, the Bitcoin course, which goes through a bit of the history of money and then how Bitcoin fits in and then how Bitcoin works. So we created these resources really to speak to the average individual. And what we recognized is that when people were kind of given the tools to understand the world around them, they just felt so much more empowered. And we have seen countless individuals reach out and just say, like, I now feel motivated to save. I now feel motivated to put off this behavior that I've been doing to the future because it's going to reward me far more if I'm just simply patient. We've seen it over and over and over again. And so I would say the one thing is we wish it targeted younger kids, but at the same time, and I think we spoke about this early on when we were founding Looking Glass, we didn't want there to be like too much overlap. And it's also hard to be able to speak to an 8-year-old and at the same time speak to an 18-year-old. And so I'd say that our content tends to be kind of, I'd say like 15 and up, kind of tends to be the Looking Glass content. A curious kid who's kind of 15 can kind of dive into this and really start to understand it. Or a parent that is motivated can take the content and kind of like articulate it in a way that kind of younger kids can understand. But ultimately, we kind of target the curious teenager and up and the adult. And that's where I just think like what Sharma is doing and being able to target the younger kids, getting kids playing around with these concepts at a young age is just truly, truly incredible. I think that it's very much needed, and introducing kids to money early on sets that foundation in that relationship. Because I think the challenge we see today is that as money has become more abstracted, we've gone from coins, physical coins, to banknotes, then from banknotes to debit cards to credit cards. Then all of a sudden we've gone completely digital where you're tapping your phone. Kids aren't interacting with physical money. So it's really hard to think about saving when it's kind of this abstracted theoretical thing where you've just got numbers on a screen. And so being able to look at money from a different lens, learn about Bitcoin very early on, I think is just setting that foundation again that I think is really important. There's actually a phenomenal TED talk that I listened to a little while back, and it's a dad who ended up swapping out all of the money in his game of Monopoly with real money. And he basically said to his kids, he was like, look, at the end of the game, you get to keep whatever money you have. And the kids are like, oh my God, really? And he's like, yeah, you got to keep any of the money you guys have, if I remember correctly, or like there's the winning prize is real money. And all of a sudden the kids change the way they play. And originally, if you just give kids a game of Monopoly and you say play, they're like, oh, you can have this card. You can have this card. I'm just going to give you this house. Oh, I'm going to lend you this money. And the kids, there's a lot of this kind of, there's no real thought going into how their play style. Whereas the moment you start making it real and you're playing with real money, the kids are a lot more conscious. They become more fiscally responsible. And so it changes their dynamic. And I think that we've become so abstracted from money. We've made it so easy to spend. And I think it's intentional. We've made money so easy to spend that people are just indebting themselves and they don't know what the consequences are. So Bitcoin, I think, is making us think about saving again and showing up more consciously.
Has there been any success stories that you've heard from people that have gone through Looking Glass that come to mind, whether it's kids or adults, but just those kind of stories that make you feel like, oh, we put this together and, it's validated and people are getting extreme value out of it?
Honestly, it's countless. It's almost hard to kind of remember specific ones. We've had many teachers. We took the course and we kind of turned it into a bit of like a school course. And I wouldn't say like it could be better. We kind of put it together at the time when we're still really figuring out like what are the key teaching points? How do we make this the best we can for teachers? And so we put it together and we created a bit of a school course for it. And I've heard of many teachers that have taken this course, brought it into their classroom, and they start teaching about the history of money and what makes Bitcoin unique and superior as a form of money, and how does Bitcoin fit into the world in which we live in today. And so it's just been, I never expected myself to ever be teaching about money, to be writing about money, the intersection of money and family, the intersection of money, the environment, how we show up. And so I just feel really lucky to be on this path and to be able to see the positive ramifications of teaching kids, adults alike about these subjects. It's just been such a pleasure, and I just feel really, really lucky.
The feeling's mutual for everybody in the space. And, for families that are out there, they're maybe just starting their journey down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, whether they're parents already or thinking about having a family in the future. What's a piece of advice you'd give them on how learning about Bitcoin and financial education could positively influence their dynamic from health to education and beyond?
So I'd say there's two things that come to mind. The first one is skin in the game. I think that sometimes we go about education backwards, getting into Bitcoin backwards, which is we think about, man, I need to learn about this thing. I need to then get the books. I need to then set up the exchange. I need to buy the Bitcoin, and I need to figure out the custody. And all of that process takes place before we ever actually purchase Bitcoin. And I think that it can be very daunting. And it doesn't provide us with the fuel and the curiosity needed to be able to kind of make it through that journey. So a lot of people drop off. So I find that going about it from the skin in the game approach, whereby if you have friends or you have family members and you want to get them into Bitcoin, gift them Bitcoin. Put Bitcoin on a little like Sats card or some form of gift card of sorts, or kind of say, hey, there's some Bitcoin waiting for you if you learn about these things. And I find when people have skin in the game, it creates curiosity. I think the reality is that Bitcoin is built on number go up. Like people, when they see this thing appreciating, it kind of creates curiosity. And that curiosity is what drives that passion to understand this thing. And so it really is like, if you have friends that are curious, if you have family members, like put a little bit of Bitcoin on a card, give them that Bitcoin, and they can see that thing grow. And that, I would say, is like one of those perfect orange pills. The second point that I'd make is that when it comes to education, you've got to meet someone where they're at. I think if you're talking to a single mum, she probably doesn't want to hear about quantitative easing and monetary policy. What she wants to hear about is, how does money actually impact my kids and my ability to meet my kids' needs? If you're talking to an economist, they probably don't care about the impact of money on their children. What they care about is quantitative easing. And so I think that being able to meet the individual where they're at and discuss the topics from their own perspective is how you support people in their own learning journey. And building on that idea, rather than diving into Bitcoin first, because although Bitcoin is the solution, people can't understand the solution if they don't understand the problem. And so I always kind of tend to discuss it from the perspective, before even mentioning the word Bitcoin, diving into the problem through the lens of the person I'm talking to. And then from there, when you start bringing up Bitcoin, it clicks far more easily. It has helped immeasurably.
For sure, meeting them where they're at is number one. And going back to your tip around kind of gifting, I do know that, I think Fold, I don't know if it's just here in the States or not, but you can actually go into grocery stores and stuff and buy Bitcoin gift cards now. So, instead of grabbing the Visa gift card, grab the Bitcoin one to make it easy, like Seb was saying. Well, before we move on to the final two questions, I want to remind everybody, they can visit shamray.com, use code BFF show for 10% off. Happy to send you the books, the games that Seb mentioned earlier, and anything else. Would love to send it your way. And now let's wrap things up with those final two questions each time. And so the first one being, a common saying in the Bitcoin space is Bitcoin is time. Another belief is that time is the scarcest asset the world has ever created. So playing off of all of that, what is the biggest gift of time that learning about Bitcoin has provided you?
Holy. I would say that what Bitcoin does to me is it extends time. Like time, I think, is relative. And I think that although we have a finite amount of time, although we can't say what that amount of time is in this physical body, we know that that time will come to an end at some point. And the challenge with the money we deal with today, fiat, whether it's the US dollar, the Canadian dollar, the New Zealand dollar, is that because it's losing purchasing power, we're constantly focused on survival. And so our aperture of awareness is narrowing as we're becoming more fearful, more stressed. And that doesn't give us the capacity to look outwards into the world and want to be altruistic and compassionate and support others and think bigger. And so I think that we're seeing the compression of time as we're simply trying to survive. Whereas with Bitcoin, when we're having the opposite taking effect, where our purchasing power is increasing and our ability to show up is becoming easier, I find that our aperture of awareness is widening again, so we can start thinking about all of these other aspects of life, being able to give back to our community, being able to challenge ourselves in our hobbies and our careers and our relationships and our families and whatnot, or being able to just kind of put ourselves out there and contribute and give back. And I think that, to me, the coolest thing about Bitcoin is that it's expanding our time, not necessarily the length, but what we can do with that time.
Nope, completely agree there. And the last question of the day, if you had one Bitcoin to give each of your future kids, in this case, at what age would you give them the keys and why?
You know what, I wonder if it's similar to like driving a car. We see at the age of kind of 22, 23, that's when the brain starts to really solidify, and a lot of our neural pathways and our brain development has kind of reached its peak, and we have a deeper sense of self. And up until that point, when it comes to, like, say, driving a car, I didn't really finish that point, but up until that point, you see much higher rates of accidents, car crashes, because our prefrontal cortex has not fully developed, and our prefrontal cortex is involved in like rational thinking and planning. And so I would say that early 20s gives kids time to really figure out who they are and how they show up and what's important to them. And at the same time, it's not so late that it can give them that foundation to be able to like direct their energy towards their career, education, whatever it may be. So I would say that, yeah, early 20s, somewhere around there, early to mid 20s.
There's a common answer. 25 seems to be the common answer thus far going through the question there. So you're right in the herd.
And I would say as well, like, there's a really interesting book called Die with Zero. And Dio Zero is really talking about how we have a very backwards in the way we think about passing on wealth to our next of kin. And it's this idea that the average inheritance is given out at the age of 60 years old. And what I mean by that is the recipient is 60 years old when they receive inheritance from their parents who die at 85, 90. And at 60 years old, you've already moved past all of the challenging moments in your life. You've raised a family, you've had to buy a home, and so that dollar has very little impact on you and how you show up at 60 years old. It's made very little difference. Inheriting money at a younger age, in your 20s, when you're at this point where a dollar goes such a long way, it has the ability to potentially put food on the table and a roof over our heads. That dollar makes such a much bigger difference to that individual. So this idea of Dio Zero is like when you have excess capacity to be, or excess cash flow or excess wealth you don't have a use for, and you're able to live your life in a sound manner, start gifting that to kids at a younger age so that kid can experience the best possible life, as opposed to struggling, and then getting a little lifeline at 60 years old, but by then they've already gone through all of the hardness in their life.
And the cool thing with something like Bitcoin being, as our kids or your future kids grow up, I'm sure there'll be, innovative and fun ways to kind of have certain, time locks and parameters around maybe some of those earlier gifts to make sure that, yes, they have access to it, but there's still maybe some control or some making sure that it's not, just jumping on a plane and heading to Vegas type thing.
Totally.
So, that's another beauty of kind of the digital nature of something like Bitcoin and the inheritance around that. Well, this has been an absolute pleasure to have you on this show. That's a wrap on everything. I will make sure, we didn't mention it, but, we did mention Seb as an author. So, whether it's Beers for Bitcoin, so that's the book that Seb and Daz wrote together that we mentioned on episode 14, or Seb's other book, The Hidden Cost of Money. I'll make sure to link to those in the show notes. They're awesome books to have anybody, have on hand, meet the people where they're at, especially Beers for Bitcoin, being able to kind of get that entry level side of things. And anything else you want to kind of link or shout out at the end of the show here?
No, I would honestly, it's been such a pleasure. And I really, really appreciate what you and Mallory are doing. I think that you guys have built just such an incredible company. And yeah, I think the world we're building relies on the next generation. And so being able to give kids the tools, being able to give them the capacity to show up authentically is so important. And so I just think, yeah, the tools you guys are building, the games you're building, the resources you're building, I think are just really, really incredible. And they kind of create that curiosity and lay the foundation for the next generation. So I really appreciate you having me on, Scott, and I'm looking forward to meeting in person.
I guess we'll find a conference or just a fun spot to meet up. And if anybody out there is listening or at conferences, especially in Canada, I'm sure you might see Seb pop up there. So don't hesitate to go say hi to him at those events.
Oh man, 100%. And the one thing I will say is, like, I never want education to be a barrier to learning. Price to be a barrier to learning. And so if someone can't afford the books that we create, that Daz and I wrote, the Hidden Cost of Money, reach out to me just on Twitter or X at Seb Bunney, or send me an email at sebbunny.com, which is where I have my blog, The Tree of Self-Sovereignty. And I'm more than happy to just send you the book, the ebook for free. Like, we really want to just make sure education is free and accessible to everyone.
No, very, very well said. And I'm sure if you asked him, he'd also autograph it for you. Perfect. Well, thank you everybody for listening. We'll catch you next week. Bye.
Hi, thanks for joining. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a good review. And buy your kids some stuff at SawMary.com today. Bye. 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 Bye.